So the second prompt is having to do with identity development. And the first question is, how has being a biracial woman born in Canada shaped my identity? To sum it up, I think it's been a confusing and beautiful experience for the development of my identity. Being a biracial mixed Muslim woman born in Canada, there's just a lot of contrasting identities, contrasting values, contrasting, just a lot of contrast, which is great. We love diversity, and that's why it's beautiful, but it's also confusing. And I think the way I can put that, and if you are mixed or biracial, you would understand this a little bit as well, in that sometimes you don't quite feel enough for anything to fit or belong in a specific group. I'm not Canadian enough because I'm a person of color and I'm Muslim, or I'm not brown enough. I'm very, people don't look at me and think South Asian. And so I don't look brown enough. I don't act brown enough. And same thing on the flip side, I'm not Arab enough. And so this has been kind of a journey of navigating what I am and where I belong. But I've decided to try and take the beauty of all of it, of all the contrasting identities, and celebrate that, because that makes me who I am. It makes me me. So on top of that, I feel a bit more connected with my Arab side simply because I speak the Arabic language, and unfortunately I do not speak Gujarati, which is my father's tongue or his language, and I don't speak any other South Asian languages. Unfortunately, I would love to learn, and maybe I will one day. It's definitely on the bucket list. I don't speak Urdu. I don't speak any South Asian language, and that's really unfortunate, especially because language is so incredibly important to cultural preservation, and I learned that in anthropology, that language is a huge component to culture. And so not speaking any South Asian language, I feel it distances me from the culture. But with that being said, I did grow up with my South Asian family, and I got to embrace that culture through them. I definitely grew up eating Indian food. I learned a few Indian dishes. I love Indian food. So there's definitely a lot of components of my father's culture that I've been able to embrace and celebrate. I think another thing that can complicate it is because my father and for many generations have lived in South Africa, which is a colonized land by the British. It's just different. It's just a different kind of culture. And I find even explaining it can be complicated. Like if I say I'm South African Gujarati, people are like, are you Indian? And I'm like, I'm not necessarily Indian. My lineage, my ancestry is Indian, but I'm not Indian. And then some people get offended when I say that, and I don't understand why, because there's no shame in that. It's just being a South African Gujarati person is different. And a little bit of a history lesson or fact is that South Africa is the second highest place where Gujarati population, the second highest population of Gujaratis, and has to do with history, and it's a really cool history. I recommend checking it out if you want to. But it's also a beautiful feeling to experience both my Arabic and Indo-South African sides, and feeling like a sort of representation of that in Canadian society, representing my Islamic values through being visibly Muslim and being a little bit more confusing as a South Asian woman, but it is what I am. And I also very much identify with being Canadian, with that though being a settler, and I acknowledge the land that I profit off of the expense of the oppression of Indigenous people through colonization. And I really feel like being Canadian and unpacking the history of Canada and aligning myself with Indigenous people has greatly influenced my Canadian identity. It's a large part of why I chose to do social work as well, after learning about the colonization and the oppression and all of that stuff that, I get to benefit off of at the expense of Indigenous peoples. And I really have my Indo-South African father to thank for this, because from a very young age, he encouraged me and encouraged my siblings and I to unpack this, to learn the history, to acknowledge it. And, he really implemented and taught me that if I'm going to live on this land, if I'm going to be Canadian, then I must learn and acknowledge the history and appreciate Sorry, just to acknowledge the history and to learn it. And to now, being a social worker, I hope to support Indigenous causes. I do appreciate Canada for many things. Superficially, things like poutine and cute winter outfits and the beauty of Banff and the Ontario Lake. Canada is a beautiful place. And on a deeper level, I appreciate the multiculturalism and diversity. And that's a big reason why I feel super passionate about the Salaam project and really passionate to connect it with Indigenous advocacy as well as multiculturalism and allyship to the Muslim community. I think there definitely needs to be more moves when it comes to Muslim awareness and tackling Islamophobia. Just recently, we've seen a multitude of hate crimes against Muslims in Canada. And generally, these things don't faze me because I'm a firm believer in that I'm not going to change who I am, and I'm not going to change my way of life, especially if I'm not hurting anybody. I'm just practicing my right to live the way I want to. And so I'm not going to change any of that. I'm not going to hide who I am because someone is hateful towards my community. But there was literally 4 attacks in 2 weeks in Edmonton against hijabi women. And it's not a nice feeling to feel like I could leave my house and be attacked or be hated on or discriminated against because I'm visibly a Muslim woman. And so there definitely needs to be a lot of work still across many avenues, not just Indigenous and Muslims. There's Black Lives Matter, there's all these other wonderful movements, and I'm really excited to relaunch the Salaam project and bring that as well because I think Canada needs it. That was question 2.